Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being part of today's Talking Biopolitics conversation. Today we're going to be talking with Renee, Tajima-Peña, and Virginia Espino. They'll be talking with Alexandra, Minna about their wonderful new documentary, No Más Bebés, and I'll introduce them a little bit more shortly. First, we have a couple of housekeeping items that we should take care of, and then we're going to see the trailer for No Más Bebés, and then we'll go to the conversation. And after that, there will be a chunk of time for your questions and comments. And the first housekeeping thing is to let you know that the way to ask your questions and make your comments is to submit them, and you can do this at any time during the hour in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom right of your screen. And just to clarify how that works, it will be the presenters who can see your questions and comments, and when we come to the period of the conversation, Alex will read them and relay them to everybody else, and she won't use your name unless you would like her to. So that's how the Q&A works, and please feel free to submit those at any time while we're talking or during the comment and participant conversation part of the hour. Okay, so let's see. I wanted to let you know that CGS's Elliot Hochland will be live tweeting this event, so you can follow along on Twitter if you would like to. And also wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded, and it will be archived online on the CGS Talking Biopolitics YouTube channel, and we'll be sending you the link to that along with a lot of other links to No Más Bebés website and other things after this call. So with that, let's go to a couple of words about the past Talking Biopolitics conversations. This is the year 3 of the Talking Biopolitics series, and at this point, as you can see, we have a real treasure trove of online conversations available, and on a range of topics, from eugenics, the history of eugenics, as this one relates to today's conversation, genomic medicine, scientific racism, behavioral genetics, and I'm just going to quickly page through these conversations, all of which, as I said, are available, and we have been hearing that people have been using some of these conversations in their classrooms, and you might consider that as an option. I also wanted to say a few words about the Center for Genetics and Society. Many of you know us. We're a public interest organization bringing a social justice and human rights perspective to bear on human genetic and assisted reproductive technologies. And our scope includes all of the issues that you see on that slide in that word cloud display there. Right now, we're very much focused on the controversy that's been building about human germline modification using new gene editing techniques. And the controversy is about whether gene editing should be used to make changes that are inherited by future children and future generations. In other words, to create genetically modified human beings. We and many, many others are deeply concerned that if this is let loose in the world, we would see it exacerbating already existing discrimination and setting up new kinds, and exacerbating reproductive injustices and social inequality in general. And we really feel that these sorts of dystopian possible outcomes would be a new kind of eugenics, a consumer-driven high-tech eugenics that would have both similarities. There would be similarities, there would also be differences from past eugenic abuses. And we've always thought that a nuanced understanding of the history and the legacy of eugenics is very important in coming to grip with the eugenic temptations that stay with us today. And that's just one of the reasons that we're so delighted to be discussing No Más Bebés today. So let me say a few words about the film. No Más Bebés is the story of women who were pushed into sterilizations while they were giving birth, at the LA County USC Medical Center during the 1960s and 1970s. And these women then sued the doctors that were involved, the state of California, and the U.S. government. They were led by an intrepid 26-year-old Chicana lawyer and armed with hospital records that had been secretly gathered by a whistleblowing young doctor. They faced public exposure, and they stood up to powerful institutions. And the story is really wonderfully told in No Mas Bebés. So we're going to now just take a couple minutes to watch the trailer.
Acá tenían camas todavía.
Mira.
Y yo por dentro sí siento mucho tristeza.
Pues
recordar
lo que siente.
¿cómo
¿Y
se
por qué
explica?
sientes tristeza al volver?
Pues, ¿sabe?
Mira,
Pero tengo tristeza.
Sí.
This baby boy became a citizen 1 minute ago. His mother does not have immigration papers.
We're told they should be sterilized to save taxpayers' welfare.
Something drastic must be done about population growth.
The doctor walked in and said, "We cut your tubes." And I said, "Why?" He goes, "Well, you signed for it." I said, "Me?" I go, "I don't remember nothing." And I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell anybody.
They were extremely fearful, being told that you need an emergency cesarean section. You can feel blood pouring down your leg. At that time, signing the consent for tubal ligation.
This is the emergency department at Los Angeles County USC Medical Center.
Some of them signed right in the midst of labor. Some of them don't even remember signing. Here it is, this young lawyer, and for the first time telling them, "Do you know that you've been sterilized?"
We are suing HEW for non-compliance or non-enforcement of the sterilization regulations.
It was just the beginning of the emergence of the civil rights movement in the Latino community. We were talking about abortion rights, all of the issues of feminism at that time. The idea that somebody could be forcibly sterilized seemed like something out of a mental institution out of the 1920s.
It's a claim that we're part of a greater goal of sterilizing the Mexican population that immigrates to Los Angeles. I mean, I'm offended by that. That's not what we did.
The way I felt when I was young, it doesn't change the way I feel in my heart now that I'm older. But it's there all the time. It's like when you bury somebody, you're always going to carry it on your head.
Okay, thank you. What I was saying was that the trailer, you can see from the trailer that this is a very compelling and moving documentary, and it's also a very important film. And if you haven't had the chance to see it yet, we'll be sending you, as I mentioned, the link to the No Mas Bebés website, which has information about screenings that are coming up. So with that, I would like to introduce our presenters today. And so Virginia, Renee, and Alex, can I ask you to share your webcams and turn on your sound? Thank you. Great. Here comes Alex and Virginia.
Hello. Hello.
Okay, great. So we just need Virginia webcam to pop up, and Virginia, if you can remember both to start it and to share it.
Sherry.
There we go. Great. Okay, great. We're all here. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being part of this conversation. Let me tell people a little bit about yourselves, and then we'll get started. So I'll start with Renee. Renee Tajima-Peña is the director and co-producer of No Mas Bebés. She's an Academy Award-winning filmmaker.
Nominated.
Her film, nominated, sorry. That's to come. Many of her films focus on immigration, race, and social issues, and they've been screened at festivals including Cannes, Sundance, Toronto, and the Whitney Biennial. And she's now the director of the Center of Ethno-Communications at UCLA, where she's a professor and holds an endowed chair in Japanese American Studies. And she's received a number of awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Alpert Award in the Arts, the USA Broad Fellowship, and a Peabody. Welcome, Renee.
Yeah.
And now Virginia, co-producer of No Mas Bebés, is an oral historian and educator, and it was Virginia's original research on the coercive sterilizations of Mexican origin women at LA County USC Medical Center that sparked the idea for this documentary. Her research has been published in Las Obreras, Chicana Politics of Work and Family, and in Latinas in the United States, a historical encyclopedia. And she has served on the California Commission for Sex Equity and the LA Chicano Latino Education Committee. And she's currently program coordinator for Latina and Latino history at the UCLA Center for Oral History Research.
I'm actually not with her anymore, but I recently resigned from that position, just to be clarified. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for letting me know.
We should now.
Okay. Want to make sure we've got it all right. Okay, let me see if I can get Alex's intro 100% correct. Alexandra Minister is Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology, American Culture, and History at the University of Michigan. Her research has focused on the history of eugenics, genetics, society, and justice in the United States and in Latin America. And her books include Telling Genes, the story of genetic counseling in America, and Eugenic Nation, Faults and Frontiers of Better Breeding in Modern America. And Eugenic Nation has just been published in a second edition by UC Press. And last but not least, Alex is a member of the advisory board of the Center for Genetics and Society, which we're very glad about. And I'm very glad to welcome you all and thank you very, very much for being with us today. So as I mentioned, we'll have you talking among yourselves for about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll pause and bring in questions and comments from other people, which can be submitted at any time in the Q&A box that everyone sees at the bottom right of their screen. So with that, I'll turn it over to the three of you.
Thank you, Marcy. Good afternoon from East Coast time, and good morning to you still on West Coast time. It's really an honor to be able to interview both of you and to have this opportunity to talk about the documentary, making the documentary, the life of the documentary now that it's out there in the world. And I wanted to start off with a question which really has to do with kind of the process and the production, which is, how did you two come together to make No Mas Bebés? What was that process? How did you find each other? Because it seems like you're a remarkable team in this effort, bringing together the documentarian and the historian. So tell us a little bit about your collaboration.
You want me to go first, Renee? You want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, we met because we're both mothers and we have children the same age. So it was actually our children who brought us together. And we live in the same neighborhood. We have a similar circle of friends. So it was really synergy that brought us together. And we both are interested in telling stories about women of color, stories that haven't been told before. We're interested in looking at the complexity of race and class and gender. And the idea of the film came from Renee, but it's based on my research when I was a doctoral student working with Vicki Reese, Dr. Vicki Reese.
Yeah, I work with everybody who lives within 3 miles of me. It just makes it a lot easier. But we live actually only a few miles from the hospital itself. And before Virginia told me about her research, I had never heard about the case. So when she first told me, I had this young child, I thought being a mother was just the best thing since sliced bread. I was in that bliss of just parenthood, and the idea that I would be denied the ability to have a child just completely blew me away. So Yeah, so I, appreciated her doing that research, and people like Alex and Virginia, Elena Gutierrez, who's also in the film, just keeping that story alive. For decades, it was basically forgotten, and the women were forgotten. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, you brought this story back to life and made visible these women's histories that were invisible for so many decades, both with the poignancy and the pain involved in the whole story. And one of the things I think the documentary does really effectively is it helps us reconstruct that past of what was going on at USC LA County Hospital in the late 60s and early 70s, both the broader historical context and then the specific dynamics, kind of what Elena Gutierrez has called the perfect storm that gave rise to these non-consensual sterilizations. And I'd like to hear both of you reflect a bit on the process of that historical reconstruction. I mean, Renee, some of that was involved, locating footage, obviously, talking to key actors, and Virginia in terms of, bringing your narrative and your analysis to bear. So what was your approach to kind of bringing that period back to life so that we could understand it? Well, I think one thing that's really hard when you, and most of my films are about Asian or Latino communities, and in film and what's not pictured, never makes it on screen. So quite often, if you look back to, different periods, our communities are never pictured. I mean, the mainstream media wasn't pictured. People often didn't have access to home movie cameras and the means of production. So it's just really hard to find footage. But this story, the story in a way is about this community as it's becoming, not only the young civil rights lawyers and young activists, but also young journalists and filmmakers who were just getting started in Los Angeles during the 1960s and 70s. And we found amazing footage at UCLA. Chon Noriega put together a whole collection of Chicano filmmakers from, all eras, but there was a whole cohort of people in the 1970s. A lot of them actually had started in the first Center for Ethno-Communications at UCLA, which was an affirmative action program at UCLA, and a lot of young filmmakers of color like Charles Burnett got their start there, and Moctezuma Esparza, Silvio Morales, Jesus Trevino. There is a whole group of Chicano filmmakers who are going out into Boyle Heights, into East Los Angeles, and really filming everyday life, filming the community in really, really authentic ways. There are young journalists like Frank Cruz, who was the only TV journalist who covered the trial, and he was the first Latino anchor in Los Angeles. He had to fight to tell stories in the community because the editors and producers didn't want to cover it. The crews didn't even want to go with him to the east side to cover these stories. And so their footage was just invaluable. When you see the footage of the hospital and, the streets and people's homes, that's all footage by mostly young Chicano reporters and filmmakers from that time.
Yeah, and I'll just add there were also photographers documenting the community with the La Raza newspaper, which was an underground newspaper, very little known about that history, and they probably took thousands and thousands of photographs of that time. So it's really a tribute to those early documentarians that we were able to put this film together in such a beautiful way.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating. I didn't realize that there was these different streams of documentary work and photographic work produced from within communities of colors themselves, especially within this, kind of specific mile radius, and that you recovered that and incorporated this into the documentary. And I think it really adds that texture and that richness and provides the appropriate stage for these women to tell their stories and remember what they went through. As you know, I've worked on the history of eugenic sterilization in California and have thought a lot about the kinds of dynamics that you capture in the film, not so much with the Madrigal case, but in state institutions where sterilizations occurred from, the early 1900s till about the 1960s. And I just wanted to share some of the patterns that we've seen. We've digitized 20,000 sterilization recommendations and are starting to look at both qualitative and quantitative patterns. And I thought we might think together about kind of the historical legacies of those and think about this question of why does California have such a problem with forced sterilization in communities of color and institutionalized vulnerable populations. It's not a question we could answer in the next 15 minutes, but it's something that I think is important to think about. We found in our research that we used census data and connected it to the sterilization data to show that Spanish surnamed individuals in 9 different institutions for that 30-year period had a 2.5 times, or 2 times 0.5 at greater risk of being sterilized than the general institutional population. And young Latinas, particularly under 18 years of age, most of Mexican origin, were at 3.5 to 3.7 greater times risk of being sterilized. So what you see, what I think we see, is a form of reproductive racism and, kind of gendered reproductive racism that's playing out in these institutions, which, I would argue kind of lays the kind of foundation and creates an environment in California where what can happen at USC LA County Hospital could happen. Now, there are many other factors involved in what happened, and I wouldn't want to just draw a straight line from what happened in the state institutions to what happened in this public hospital. But I'm thinking about, how do we connect those dots not only between this eugenic sterilization era, and then we might call the Madrigal, episode kind of a population control era, to also thinking about what happened in the prisons, which we're all aware of, between 2006 and 2010, when about 150 women at 2 California state prisons were sterilized without proper authorization, and it looks likely that, at least several dozen of them were coerced into those procedures. So I'm wondering, and it's very likely that as you have circulated, and I know you have done so many different interviews, and there's been so much enthusiasm and interest in the film, both have you received one, kind of 2 questions. One, have you received, do you hear questions about kind of this bigger picture of California and reproductive justice? And the second would be to think about how is understanding this episode and this story at the depth that you now understand it, how does that change your understanding of kind of California history around reproductive health, institutions, prison populations? It's kind of the legacy of the work you've done, and how do we connect the dots over the 20th century to today?
Well, it seems that there's a basic tenet to these kinds of sterilizations, and that's who's fit to procreate, who's fit, who's unfit, and who gets to decide, who gets to make those decisions. Quite often it's women of color, working class women of color, who are at the mercy of the state and medical institutions that are funded by the state or by the nation. But I don't know enough about other states like Alabama, some places in the Deep South. I mean, can we really say California is unique in their target of Mexican American women or Mexican origin women? I'm not really sure if, I don't feel comfortable saying that because I don't know enough about these other places, because I think all women of color who use public hospitals are always being convinced, coerced, pushed, lied to about these kinds of procedures, what they should do to control their fertility. Last night at a screening, a young woman came forward with her parents who was in the audience, and she said that her mother was told in the 90s after her birth, she was born in 95, I believe, that a sterilization was necessary, was medically necessary, because she was in her 30s And if she had any more children, there was the potential of Down syndrome and other disorders that she needed to be wary of, and that it was for her good that she didn't have any more children. So they convinced her to sign the consent for a sterilization surgery. So she said it just echoed, watching the film, No Mas Bebés, echoed what her parents experienced in the 90s. And it's just a big question about power dynamics and power play.
I agree.
Who is at the mercy?
I agree with Virginia. They say the womb is a battleground. So I think in California or Puerto Rico or in Alabama and Mississippi or any place where these kinds of the control of women's bodies has happened either in sterilization or any other way, it's always related to this question of there's a politics behind it, or there's a crisis of the state behind it. So I think it's a bigger question than one region.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things that, Virginia, your comment, made me think of, and I think is shown in the documentary, is the kind of intergenerational trauma that is part of the story. And also, one of the things I found in my research is that very few people sterilized in state institutions wanted to come forward and tell their story because of shame, because of secrecy, and because of just the pain that's involved in having to relive that to some extent. I think the documentary really captures that so powerfully, and it's very emotional to watch these women remembering often with family members right next to them who are sometimes often learning about this for the first time. Can you, Renee, and I'm sure Virginia too, tell us about the work that it took to locate the women and to invite them to tell their story in a way that they felt comfortable with, and maybe, I don't know if I would go so far as to call it a process of catharsis, but something where they felt included in community as part of this, and not, I think it moved them from maybe isolation in their story to feeling a sense of community and connection to kind of some of the political struggles that you've talked about, maybe not overtly as in marching in the streets, but definitely maybe in a quieter, subtler way. So tell us more about these courageous women and how you were able to bring their faces and their voices into the documentary. It took a lot of detective work because all we had to go by was these old court records, and they were records from the 1970s. Nobody had really talked to them in the press, or I guess no scholars had even talked to them in the past 35 years since the trial happened. So we would, luckily we live on the east side where they live, so we would just knock on doors. We would just walk around neighborhoods, and we have a couple of friends who are private investigators who ended up helping us locate the women. And for the most part, we found that their families still didn't know what had happened to them, even decades later. And quite often they asked their children, should I participate in this film? Should I go on camera? And when their kids found out, their kids knew there were no more babies in the family. Their kids knew that there was a trauma, but they didn't know what had really happened. So when they heard the story, it made a lot of sense to them. And they also took a lot of pride in their mothers and their mothers standing up and being a part of this historic case. And they said, please participate. We want you to tell your story. So that got some of the mothers to agree. And I have to give credit to Virginia, who really spent time and developed a relationship. I mean, they loved her as soon as they met her. She was like, their daughter, or they feed her and everything. So we get fed because they all love Virginia. But she really, I think because she's been an oral historian for so long, and she grew up here I'm telling your story, sorry about that, Virginia, but I mean, she's from here. She went to Franklin High, and so, they considered her like family immediately.
Yeah, I'll just echo. Yeah, that's,
sorry.
when I first met, well, like you, Alex, we've lived with these names, Madrigal, Hermosillo, Figueroa, Hurtado. We know those names so well. So when it was time to meet Dolores Madrigal, I was really nervous, but it was an instantaneous bond, and I felt like we were destined to know each other. You know, I was destined to meet her and help her tell the story, although it was something that in the end became too painful for her to continue telling and retelling. But at the moment, I think she was relieved. I think they're all relieved that 40-some years later, people believe what they said and want to hear that history, want to hear their side of the story.
One of the things that I really appreciate about the documentary is that it brings out, you know, some of the tensions between, you know, which I've studied and many others have studied, between kind of what was going on with the white feminist reproductive rights movement and its, you know, pretty exclusive focus on abortion rights in the 1970s, and what was going on, you know, in some communities of color, particularly with Puerto Rican women and Chicano women, you know, which really, where the struggle was really the right to have a child. And of course, that then sets the stage for the reproductive justice movement, you know, the tenets of which are the right to have a child, not have a child, and raise that child in a healthy environment. So I really view this film as contributing historically to our understanding the genesis of reproductive justice, and also as a contemporary intervention into thinking about these issues, which are just as relevant today as they were then. And we think about what's going on in the Supreme Court today with, you know, assaults on abortion rights. You know, this, from my perspective, your film directly speaks to thinking about those issues of reproductive autonomy. Can you talk some about how you see your film speaking to reproductive justice issues today, either how, you know, some particular reflections or ideas you have, and or any comments that you've received, or how the impact that it's had, because it seems like this documentary has had, you know, a really amazing impact, and there's so much enthusiasm about it. I don't know, both of you are so busy. Every time I talk to Renee, she's in a different city doing a different screening. So people are hungry for this, and they're hungry for this because it's an important history, but because it's very much connected to the contemporary struggles that we're all very much a part of. So can you talk a little bit about that, and also where, you know, where you see, where it's been and where you see it going in these struggles?
I mean, when I started the film, I really kind of looked at it as maybe an immigration issue and something just terrible that happened. But, you know, in the process of making the film, I learned a lot about the just broader idea of reproductive justice. So as my thinking evolved and working with Virginia, I started to see it more in terms of, you know, a fundamental question of who controls my body and reproductive autonomy, not only specifically sterilization. So that, you know, I think that became the guiding force of the film, and I think that's what people have been connecting with. And just in terms of that tension with white feminists, Virginia has always said something like, you know, motherhood is a political act. And I think in growing up as an activist, I remember thinking that a disconnect, and not only white feminists, but, you know, just mainstream feminists, let's say, this disconnect with, because I come from a family, you know, 3 generations lived in my household. You know, my grandparents were immigrants. We really valued family. We valued children and being together, and I always noticed that there was this kind of disdain in a way, and I'm talking about much earlier, like in the 1970s or 1980s, for this idea of family, because there were, you know, women were resisting those traditional roles of motherhood and being a wife. But I wanted to be a wife and mother as well as have a career. So personally, I felt that disconnection, and I think professionally and as a filmmaker and in terms of women's activism, you know, I start to see it in a broader way. So So these women, and one thing that really interested me about Virginia's research is the mothers were asserting their value of children and family. They were asserting that, you know, and it's not something that was immediately appreciated.
Yeah, that's so true for me as well, growing up in the 70s and 80s and coming of age at a time when women were rejecting the ideals of Leave It to Beaver type of family and the nuclear family having children, the heteronormative family. But I tried to address that because the Chicanas, who were the activists, who became the lawyers, who became the political operatives like Gloria Molina, they didn't want to have children either. They didn't want to get married right away. They wanted their education. They wanted their profession. They wanted to, I think in some cases they would say, we were rejecting what our mothers were, but at the same time they adored their mothers. And these women in the Madrigal case represented women like their moms. So they were able to reshape their politics to accept both their reality as young women coming of age in the 70s with their mother's reality in a more traditional, possibly more of a patriarchal relationship. And I thought that was really interesting that they were able to mold this whole new politic. And that's what they were doing with this case. But I also want to just note that there were many allies from the white community, from the European American community. We have Dr. Bernard Rosenfeld, huge ally. We have Dr. Banker, who was an ally. And I think it was more of the mainstream feminists who were really embracing this politic of abortion on demand that limited their view of some of these other issues that were taking place at the same time. And I mean, you know, today, I mean, I think that there are some people who do not like the 72-hour waiting period for sterilization surgery. There are still those critics out there.
Exactly. No, and that debate is ongoing right now. Are those safeguards necessary because of the abuse, or are they, you know, kind of a relic of the past that is too, frankly, you know, still highly paternalistic in stopping women from obtaining birth control? Now it's 2:40. So we reached this point where we're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we're going to be taking questions from our participants. So we'll shift now to that and be right back.
I'm sorry for the interruption, but I just want to give people a chance to submit their questions and comments. And the way to do that, if you missed it at the beginning, is to type it into that Q&A box you see at the bottom right of your screen. And Alex will relay your questions and comments, and we'll then continue the conversation. But we also did want to let you know a couple of things that are available to you and will be coming your way. We'll send all these links to you in an email after we're done here today. So we'll be sending you these links to Renee, Virginia's, and Alexandra's website, and to the No Mas Bebés website as well. And we also wanted to let you know that here at the Center for Genetics and Society, we have a lot of resources on our website about related topics, including in the categories of eugenics, about California, and about assisted reproduction in general. And then we also wanted to let you know about some other resources we have at the Center for Genetics and Society, and also to invite you, to ask you if you would be willing to consider contributing to our work by donating to show your support. And we wanted to let you know that we have all these free resources. We have a newsletter that comes out every other week. We have an active and wonderful Twitter and Facebook account. And on our website, we have we have 9,000 pages of materials on our website of information about a range of human genetic and assisted reproductive technologies, from the kind of reproductive justice, social justice, human rights perspectives that you're hearing today. And we have a blog that we constantly refresh as well. So all that is available to you. And just one more time, we would love to bring your comments into this conversation, your questions. And please, I see people are submitting, and so please continue to do that. And I'm going to turn it back to Alexandra, Renee, and Virginia know.
Great. I'm looking over some of the questions that we have from our participants, and they seem to fall in kind of two categories. The first is the film as an educational resource and its audiences. Where is it being screened? Where can it be screened? How can people get access to it? So maybe that's one question. People do want to know where they can see it. I realize it was available through PBS through February 22nd, but you'll have information about where they can find it. And then, you know, have you been showing it in high schools? What kinds of venues have you been to with the film?
Oh my God, everything from, yeah, high schools to, we showed it at a convention of home healthcare workers, neighborhood healthcare workers. We've shown it at like MIT, Wellesley, film festivals. I just showed it at, it was amazing. It was in the Rio Grande Valley where they don't have PBS anymore. I think they sold the spectrum to somebody. And in this huge theater, nobody was over 30 years old, just these reproductive justice organizations and these young people who wanted to see the film. You know, they just organized the screening. So people, I think, are really hungry to connect with the story. But yeah, it's just been every kind of venue you can think of.
And we'll have our, I think it's our first, right, Renee? Mendez High School next week. So our first high school screening next week here in Los Angeles at Mendez High School, named after the family in Mendez versus Westminster, the desegregation lawsuit. So that's going to be really exciting.
I have an interesting historical tidbit on that. The lawyer who helped argue that also was the lawyer who worked with a Mexican-American mother in 1939 to file the only lawsuit that was a constitutional challenge to California's eugenic sterilization.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Garcia?
He was a good progressive Jewish lawyer from New York. So the other questions also seem to be moving, in addition to educational, into kind of the realm of thinking about politics and activism. So one person asked, what is the next step? What can women do today to demand reproductive justice? That's a very big question, but how do you think your film fits into, especially supplying young people with the kind of knowledge and history?
Well, can I just say that if you want to access our film, Good Docs is our educational distributor, and they have a website, gooddocs.com, I believe. That's where you can get information on having institutions purchase it. But the film it's a vehicle for discussion and conversation, and we also are very closely tied to the California Latinas for Reproductive Justice and other reproductive justice organizations throughout the state. So we're trying to merge our film with the work that they're doing, and hopefully they can use the film in the work that they're doing with their communities. That's how we got hooked up with the healthcare workers that Renee was talking about, the promotoras. We were able to screen our film there, and generally it's not a community that really wants to openly talk about reproductive justice and abortion access and things like that. So the film was a very comfortable way to start opening that discussion with people who might feel it's something that's very private and personal and not wanting to make it public. So I see that's one avenue, one way to do it is find out where these orgs are, get involved, donate. They're always trying to raise money. They're always looking for people to get out and work on their behalf.
Yes, I can say as a filmmaker, I've always made films about social issues. Although I'd like to think, you know, we all would like to think that our films are what's moving history. I think we're only a tool. The films are a tool. So these on-the-ground organizations that Virginia was talking about, that's what's moving the dial forward. And so we really follow their lead in terms of how to use the film, even how to, you know, shape the conversation and how to kind of build this dialogue. So that's where the change is happening.
Mm-hmm. Another question is about one of the clips you show from the doctor training video in the documentary, that suggests it's the doctor's responsibility to engage in family planning. Can you theorize a bit more about why these doctors did feel compelled to perform these sterilizations, even though they knew that without acquiring informed consent, even though they knew that that's, you know, Hippocratically what they should be doing? Which kind of relates to a second question, you know, just trying to understand what was this historical context that allowed doctors to behave that way. But thinking of it in 2016, you know, what about kind of culpability today? We know that in other states, North Carolina and Virginia, and also in Alberta, states have taken responsibility for sterilization, and people have received monetary compensation. Do you think that there's, you know, that could be a response to what happened at USC LA County Hospital? So one question, respond to either about the doctors and kind of their mindset at the time, and the other would be looking back, you know, we can say that definitely people were wronged, and maybe someone should pay the price. And do you agree with that? And if so, what would that look like?
Well, Alex mentioned earlier Elena's idea of the perfect storm of all these intersecting social factors that produce this environment for sterilization abuse in the 1970s in this case. And so you had the fear of a population explosion, which really resonates today in California with the whole drought and this kind of idea that the immigrants are causing the water shortage. Then you've got, you know, this fear of poor women having children to get welfare benefits, and just the hostility towards immigrants, this kind of idea that Mexican women are hyperfertile and, you know, so-called breed like rabbits. So all these things were going on at the time. So I think there are so many different forces, but at the same time there are so many different motivations for doctors to participate in these kinds of practices. You know, on the one hand, because you had, you know, they were in a public hospital with like an assembly line where they were delivering, you know, thousands and thousands of babies every year. They were laboring in the hallway. You see that footage. It's from LA County during that time. There are women just literally out there in labor in gurneys lined up in a hallway because they didn't have places to put them. So you might have a doctor, they rush in, they have their, you know, their shift starts, somebody hands them a consent form, and this doctor thinks this woman wants to be sterilized. And you have the entire spectrum to the doctors who think that, oh, this is what's better for her. She doesn't really understand. You know, she shouldn't have more than 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 children. Then you have the doctors who, you know, did not want any more brown babies to be born. And in fact, we know of a woman who's Sri Lankan whose mother was told that in 1974 by a private doctor in Washington State. She was there to deliver her first and only child because she was sterilized afterwards. And the doctors just told her, we have too many brown babies already. And without her consent, performed the sterilization. So in terms of the doctor's motivations, a lot of things were going on. So I think it's that, you know, being able to look at all these complexities, that's what produces, I think, these kinds of abuses.
You want to add to that, Virginia?
It's a real complicated situation when you have people involved in these sterilizations who aren't in the film. People like the nurses, the social workers, we don't have their voice, so we don't know what role that they played in this whole scenario of convincing women or pushing these sterilizations on women. In one case, it was the nurse, because I think it was Malvina Hurtado who says la muchacha, which is the girl, you know, or the nurse, or maybe the social worker, is the one who grabbed my hand. So you have a series of practices that the hospital thinks are good practices, are best practices. Someone like Dr. Quilligan is even today stating that he felt it was proper to ask a woman at the time of labor if she wanted a sterilization, especially if she had more than 5 children. Like, that's a normal thing to do, which I think for many of us is a very confusing type of thinking, because no woman should be asked at the time of labor if she wants a procedure that's not medically urgent or necessary. So I think that comes into play, where you have, again, these power structures that are involved. Part of it's language, part of it is an economic question, and another factor that we haven't talked about is the worry that the mothers came with to the hospital. Many of them came for emergency cesarean surgeries or emergency deliveries, so they had this panic that was part of their disposition at the time when being asked. So that's another factor that I think needs to be considered. It's not something that informed consent really looks at. It's like, what is the state of mind of the person who we're talking to at this moment about a non-emergency surgery? You know, is she in panic? Does she just want to deliver this child safely? You know, what are all of those questions that are not being asked? One of the places where we have screened is at medical schools. So I think the beauty of this film is how it's able to talk to all of these different audiences, from the healthcare workers who primarily Spanish speaking, primarily immigrant communities, to medical students at places like Brown University.
And your second question about the reparations and redress in North Carolina and Virginia, they were sterilized under eugenics laws, so technically these women were sterilized in a different kind of context. So they wouldn't have the same kind of legal redress to their sterilizations. And then, you know, the trial itself was really this. They were suing individual doctors. They prevailed actually in their lawsuit against the state and the federal government. There was no individual compensation, but the protocols were reformed in HEW, which is federal, and California state. So they did prevail in that sense. But, you know, the individual suits were, you know, I think legally was very difficult to prove, and I don't think they appealed, and you can't, you know, double jeopardy. You can't retry that. It's a civil case. I don't know there's double jeopardy in a civil case, but you can't really, I guess, retry those individual doctors. That might not even be the point, because there was this systemic abuse of the women and the institutional practices.
Yeah, I think those differences are important. Well, we're coming towards the kind of end of the hour, and I wanted to wrap up with a question which connects your documentary specifically to some of the work that CGS does. And as Marcy was saying before, you know, one of CGS's main issues right now is raising some of the alarm bells around human genetic modification technologies and the idea of kind of tinkering with genes to potentially produce designer babies. You know, your film really looks at kind of an era that is characterized by medical paternalism, we could say by neo-eugenics. You know, it's very much of a kind of the heavy hand of not necessarily, you know, the state, but physicians and institutions. Human genetic modification is unfolding in an era that's characterized more as kind of individualized eugenics or liberal eugenics, where people who can buy or access these technologies feel like they have a right to do so, because who wouldn't want a better or healthier baby? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about some of the similarities or dissimilarities between the issues around maybe reproductive autonomy, or even thinking about, we haven't talked much about disability rights or how those would figure into this larger picture. But do you have any thoughts on that, how that relates to contemporary potential, kind of the potentials of eugenics in the 21st century?
Well, I mean, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, I'll go. I just want to say, I mean, I'm obviously Latina. I'm a woman of color, brown skin, brown hair, brown eyes. I grew up at a time where I never saw myself on television. I had never had role models in my school. My education was primarily by white teachers, and I always grew up with the feeling of not being as good, as valued. My daughter looks very similar to me, brown hair, brown eyes, and it saddens me to think that what is the ideal could be that with this kind of technology that you're talking about, what is the ideal going to be? Is it going to be the blonde, blue-eyed, you know, high IQ? You know, what about the artists and the musicians, and what about the painters, and I mean, and the house painters, you know, not just the artist painters, but people who do all of these other crafts for us and make up our society and make it complex and interesting. So but at the same time, you know, individual choice and what is your right, it's very complicated. It's a real, you know, I don't have an answer.
I mean, I think what's
really don't want all one kind of human. You know, I think it's diversity is wonderful, and class and economic and way of thinking and lifestyle. I mean, it just really is what makes this country great.
So if you can wrap up quickly, Renee, because we're almost...
Yeah, I think it's a fundamental question of power and class and race, and the story of this film is those women who are poor, immigrant women, were kept out of the conversation. So, you know, what I try to do as a filmmaker is just bring those kinds of discussions to a broader public, because I know my other hat is in the academy, and even in the academy, those voices, people who are actually living these, have the lived experience on the ground, are never a part of the conversation either. So I think that's, you know, really, that's fundamental. It's just, you know, we can't talk among ourselves, and, you know, policy has to be made by the people who are affected by those policies.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was a real treat to talk to both of you, and I'll hand it over to Marcy now to take us to the top of the hour.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really want to thank you, all of you. This was an amazing conversation, and thank you also for all your work. Renee and Virginia, your work on the film, and Alex, too, your work on all the books that you've written. So thanks to everyone who participated, and as I mentioned, we'll be sending you lots of links in a little while, following up in an email. And as soon as we disconnect here in a few seconds, we're going to take you to a screen with a few short questions that we're going to ask you to share your thoughts about this presentation and the Talking Biopolitics series to help us do better in the future. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.